Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Andrei Curdescu is here today to discuss the Posthuman Dada guide, Tzara and Lenin Play Chess. An epic chess game is envisioned between Tristan Tzara, the father of Dada, and V.I. Lenin, the father of communism. This battle between radical visions of art and ideological revolution is a metaphor for two poles of 20th and 21st century thought, politics, and life, which ultimately strives to teach us about surviving our ultra-connected present and future. Andrei Curdescu is the author of 40 books of poetry, fiction, and essays, and the founder of Exquisite Corpse, a journal of life and letters. He received a Peabody Award for the PBS version of his film Rhodes Scholar, and is currently the McCurdy Distinguished Professor of English at Louisiana State University. He has been a commentator on NPR's All Things Considered since 1983, and I don't know if he knows this is true, but he was the inaugural speaker for the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series with the talk he gave on April 28th, 2000. Please join me in welcoming Andrei Curdescu to Microsoft to discuss the Posthuman Dada guide, Tzara and Lenin Play Chess.
Thank you, and thank you for reminding me of the date. I forgot. That was actually 2000. It was the millennium I came here. And I had the opportunity to speak about poetry as currency. And I got some very strange looks from the audience. They thought I was hallucinating. And now it's true. Nobody laughs anymore when I say that. Poems are like your fingerprints. They're unique. Only you can make them. They're a little bit like scrap, you know. They don't have to be authorized by anybody. Those are serious words here. So that is what I do, but I am currently pushing the Posthuman Dada guide, Tzara and Lenin Play Chess. It is a book about a game of chess that may or may not have taken place in Zurich in 1916, where both a very young Romanian poet from a remote part of Romania, Tristan Tzara, and Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, the daddy of communism, were in Zurich in exile, and they spent an awful lot of time in the two cafes where exiles were hanging out, Café de l'Odéon and Café de la Terrasse, playing chess. A lot of the refugees in Zurich at the time, they were refugees from World War I, which was raging in Europe all around them. Switzerland was neutral. The place was full, in addition to Tzara and Lenin, of all kinds of conspirators and artists and spies from the warring powers. A wonderful play by Tom Stoppard, Travesties, where he mentioned spies watching spies. It was the main occupation of people in Zurich for many wars, but in this one in particular. Tristan Tzara was 20 years old, an artist, a poet, and he was, of course, watched more closely by the Swiss police than this balding, middle-aged Bolshevik who lived there under a pseudonym, Lenin. And the reason the Swiss police was watching Tzara was because every evening he and his friends, Hugo Ball and Emmy Henning and Marcel Janko and a number of other names who became very well-known in 20th century art and literature, were perpetrating outrages at Cabaret Voltaire, at one peopleGÇ, which was a restaurant that had been rented to the German artist Hugo Ball by an unsuspecting landlord. What they did at Cabaret Voltaire was to recite poetry every evening, to invent new forms of poetry, simultaneous poetry, sing absurd songs, try to provoke some kind of feeling in the audience, which was not very hard in the middle of the war because everybody was quite upset. All around them, millions of people were dying. Everybody knew somebody who was in the war. So when Emmy Henning sang Berlin Schlager, people wept and got drunker. And when the poetry was recited at the same time in different languages, other sentiments came to the surface. these people, without really consciously knowing it yet, were creating the 20th century art, and they're giving a new shape to the 20th century. At the same time, Lenin, who was there with his comrades Radek and Zinoviev, was writing essays and manifestos that are being smuggled back into Russia and waiting. The year was 1916, the Russian Revolution was in 1917. Lenin was waiting for a way to get back to Russia, where he finally did get to, thanks to the German High Command, which had a very great interest in getting Russia out of the war, and they figured that if Lenin's revolution succeeded this time, Russia would pull out of the war, and that's indeed what happened. They passed the time playing chess. So my book is a book about the ideas of art and how the art of Dadas and the Dadaists transformed the art of the century, but also how it generated forms that they're still vital and that we're still using, and that are still very important and creative in ways that people didn't even consider or couldn't consider at the time. And how in this game, ideology, communist ideology, which seemed to, or Leninism, which seemed to be the winner of the game until 1991 and the Soviet Union collapsed, was not. And that Dada was, in fact, and Tristan Tzara won this particular chess game. This book is also about chess, which may interest some of you here, because the history of chess is very interesting, and it mirrors in many ways the history of the events narrated here and the history of the events that led to this particular game. And it's interesting that in the Soviet Union, chess became a national obsession and a sport that was taught in schools, and there was a chess academy. And to this day, the obsession to chess go on. Ilyumzhinov, in his little republic in the former USSR, has built a chess city where he's a grandmaster himself and the dictator. No contradiction there. All grandmasters are insane, actually, or will be. The game was for them. I mean, I'm not sure what kind of player Tzara would have been. Probably not a very good one, since he was an anarchist and a Dadaist. Just the fact that he played chess is pretty extraordinary, because he actually followed the laws of chess. They're called laws, not rules, by the way. And Benjamin Franklin had a hard time with chess too. At one point he got up in a huff from a table in France and said, "I don't want to play this royalist game," and he just threw the game. What was it that the Dadas did? Well, what they did, for one thing, is to say no. The avant-gardes of the 20th centuries were many. The first one was futurism, which the Manifesto of Futurism was written in 1909 by F.T. Marinetti, an Italian artist and poet. Followed in short order by constructivism in Russia, which also led to a number of architectural ideas in the Soviet Union. And surrealism in the 1930s, all avant-gardes and movements that intended to change society, not just art. That they had an agenda that went very much, I mean, art was the tool, but the intentions are much wider than that. And all of these avant-gardes became historical, and they were collectible. And so the Museum of Modern Art a few years ago could have a retrospective of surrealism, no problem, because surrealism has a recognizable style. The Dadaists never had or purposefully sabotaged the idea of a recognizable style. The only thing you can possibly call Dadaist is the typography, because they did print things that used type. So they made new things all the time. They did not, and they made them quickly obsolete and quickly able to disappear from sight. Collage was a preeminent mode of work. They cut newspapers and pictures, and they put them together, but always done with very cheap materials, very cheap stuff, so that it wouldn't stay around. So consequently, 2 years ago, I think, when the Museum of Modern Art finally mounted a Dada exhibition, they exhibited some of the things that are consecrated, like the upside-down toilet of Marcel Duchamp, which is in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and a few other things, but mainly writings. Mainly Dada was about text. And so the writings of Tristan Tzara, a great poet, were a part of this retrospective, and a few objects, like the urinal and a few collages by Kirchwitters and so on. Now, my book, the intention of my book was really to see why Dada is so alive and why it kept being fascinating, and it keeps being fascinating to young people and young artists, while all these other movements became historical. What is it in Dada that keeps it alive, that still turns people on? Why Dada had a career in the 60s in various theatrical experiments and artistic experiments and revolutionary experiments, political ones. Why it continued to have a life in punk, why it continued to have a life in neo-punk, and why it continues to have a greater life now when we are finally learning how to put different forms of art together, so that we have in movies and poetry and painting and sculpture and clothes design and all of this stuff find each other and find different places where they connect. And Dada makes that possible. And, you know, this book speculates, this essay investigates why there is life in this. And some of the answers are simple. The word Dada is great. Just the word is terrific. Da means yes in Romanian and Russian, and Dada could mean any number of things. Dada, like, oh yeah. Or, you know, yes, yes, sure. There was a huge fight over the ownership of the word, because Tristan Tzara claimed it, as he probably did coin it. He gets it on points from me. But Richard Hulsenbeck, who later became a very respected psychoanalyst in New York on Park Avenue under the name R. Hulbeck, claims that he and Hugo Ball found the word by opening the petits-Russes at random and finding the word Dada, which means it's a French toy, a hobby horse, something for a toy for children. So, but you know, the fact that this fight became important between the Romanian-French faction and the German faction of Dada. I mean, obviously there are no factions at the beginning, but history has a wonderful way of creating factions, or time. Why it became important is simply because the word does seem to carry this charge. So there is that. There is that. And the other is that Dada was such a response to the slaughter going on in Europe and such a revolt against the Western tradition of logic since the Enlightenment that it put forth a radical no. It just said no to everything. You know, just like, was it Nancy Reagan? Just say no. So they just said no. And that appeals. That really appeals, because every time something seemed to construct itself into a definite expression or a form that could be recognized, the Dadaists were there to say no, and it turns out that they were right. My book is called Posthuman, and I'll tell you in a minute why, and I'll read you a little passage from it. Then maybe we can have a talk, a question and answer. But I call it posthuman for various reasons, and this is the perfect place to talk, because this is the house of the posthuman world. You know, so it's an ambiguous word. I don't know, you know, and it is not part of the series of words that we're used to. We use the prefix post-wit, like postmodern, post-feminist, post-colonialist, etc., which is used in the universities. Postmodernism is a style. Post-feminism is a reaction to the first wave of feminism in the 60s. Post-colonialism is about people who got away from empires. So these are all, you know, culturally studyable things, but posthuman is something else. I think it belongs to an order of an evolutionary order. we are evolving, and there is something now that you know very well, that you're plugged into all kinds of things, that we are having our neurons rearranged, and our whole physical existence is now becoming transformed because of the kinds of information we use and practice. And so posthuman means that transitional kind of phase, you know. I mean, it doesn't mean you're not human, although I don't think there's anything great about being human, particularly. I mean, I'd rather be a dog myself. I mean, well taken care of, but, you know. But, you know, was it great to be human in the 20th century? Was it great to be a Jewish human being in 1942? You know, was it great to be a human serf in the 19th century Russia? No, not too great. So, you know, for the humanities in the universities to appropriate the word human to mean somehow the study of human as a noble creature is really a mistake. You know, that's just to take care of, you know, a $1 billion business in the universities there. So, I mean, posthuman is just transitional. I mean, we'll find a better word for it. The other energy that Dada put forth that I think is extremely useful to us is that it's claimed, because of its work with the unconscious and with the creative side of dreams and automatic writing and so on, it claimed to have a connection to a natural world. They also had a passion for so-called primitive art, for African and oceanic art, for art that was used ritually to connect people to the universe. And so there is in Dada a great connection and passion for the non-humanistic art, and so there are inhuman sources or non-human sources that come to play in the work of the Dadaist chants that are taken from sacred old poetries, things used to make connections with nature and to keep people within it. And I think this is, again, why it's very timely, because we're now, again, feeling, you know, both our power and our insignificance. So I will just read a little short piece about this business of posthuman. Also, this is a special copy. It has cheat sheets in it. You know. People ask questions, and then you can lift them, and you can actually read what's inside. But these are mostly my notes, you know, about one thing or another. And really, they have nothing to do with anything. Just in case people ask something that opens to these. I mean, for instance, is a really filthy one. I am not satisfied with ambiguity. It takes two of them to get me off. That was a terrible person. Anyway, here's a little bit about this business of posthumanity. Okay, here it is. It says the good. I'm talking about the information used here in this book, and I said the good available information Googled, either from Google or out of books written by Dada chiefs, will be used here to its utmost. That is to say, used in order to extract or prolong its vital fluids, which are as yet ungooglified. That's a word I made up. At least until this is e-published, and it is actually. You can get it on Kindle. I know that Google, a mortal company, could go the way of Xerox, which used to be synonymous with copying. But in the grand collage that is Dada, past and future are equally usable. Look at the fragment from a newspaper inserted by Kurt Schwitters in his 1920 collage. The actual newspaper, with its also urgent events of the day, is long forgotten, but the section preserved in Schwitters' collage is immortal. I am not saying that this guy, the simple book, will outlast both Xerox and Google, but it is possible. If the 20th century has taught us anything, is that we will forget everything except the box it came in. The substance of what it was, what it felt like, what could be usefully gleaned from it was buried with the persons who felt and gleaned. Memoirs and history further dismembered the past by articulating it. Every articulated experience is as good as forgotten. Forgetting is a human specialty that was greatly refined by the recently deposed century. We've kept the wrappings, though, the styles, the anecdotes, the narratives, the sexy ones, not the academic, and we're using them to deposit new contents inside. And he goes on to make an analysis of this business of what is human, non-human, what is remembered, and what is forgotten. Now, clearly, you're in a business where your business is to help people forget, because you're creating these things that you can put all your memories in, so we can be once again innocent as babies and stupid as grown-ups. So this is it's the ongoing technology of storing things away and not remembering them. On the one hand, could make room for for other things. On the other hand, it could also mean that we're losing the connections between all those things that we remembered and knew, and could put together in our heads by having them, inside the memory stick, like I have my last 3 novels. This is a guide for living, and I think it's of interest to you particularly because I think that the business of the box it came in is really important. For various reasons, I'm sure you can tell me more about that. But speaking of ideas, I think there is in the creative impulse and the creative understanding of this art a way into the future, and it's happily, for me, we have a nice economic depression to make this apt. Things like art and artists work better when the general public is dissatisfied with their lives and things seem to be collapsing. We have suddenly we feel alive again. I also live in New Orleans, which had a recent catastrophe, and I can tell you that art is really cooking there. So I would like to, I don't know how our time is.
We're good.
We're good.
You want to open it? I'm sure though.
We can open it to question. I was going to read a poem that actually puts the whole thing in perspective, both the Dada, the communists, and vampires, which I know you're all vitally interested in. Since I'm from both Transylvania and New Orleans, this is an urgent thing. This is called Desk 07 in the reading room at the British Library. It was written a few years ago when my wife and I were there. Marx and Engels write the Communist Manifesto at the next desk, 08. While at 06, Bram Stoker is looking over Transylvania in a book. Thieves operate in this room. Above my leather desk, 07. Lenin, at 05, is penning communiques. His application for a reader's card under the name Jacob Richter has been approved yesterday, and it will end in the permanent exhibit at the British Library, being viewed by Andrei and Laura Kodrescu. Richter, muses Laura, like the scale. Jacob Richter, who will cause a large magnitude earthquake in the world. In the Czech Republic, a few days hence, the couple is met by a student named Geiger, born after the Velvet Revolution that undid Lenin's earthquake, many millions of dead people later. And a new name is born out of the still heaving womb of the 20th century, Geiger Richter, a radiation reader who detects seismic activity. The Memory and Mind exhibition at the British Museum until September 23, 2003. Marx and Engels go to the pub. They've had a good day on the manifesto, where they admire the bartender, Jenny, Karl Marx's future wife, to whom he is already penning dreadful love poems he is careful to hide from Engels. Frau Engels expects the man for dinner. She's fuming. The roast is dry. They've been at the pub for 6 hours, imagining the future. The future, my ass, explodes Frau Engels. It's not Jenny, isn't it? Bram Stoker goes walking in Hampstead Heath with a boner for Lucy, who is already succumbing in his mind to the Transylvanian count he has just imagined. The future will include Jenny and Frau Engels only for a little while, and the Marxian utopia and the vampire will go on a long while. The Marxian future fails spectacularly after 2/3 of a century, but the vampire keeps chugging along, far from spent, into another millennium. Thieves operate in this room. How true. Thieves are among whom are future burglars, aka poets, imagination workers, poor young in love with waitresses, and virtuous, corruptible Lucies, too shy to ever steal anything physically, not afraid, on the other hand, to break into the future and clean it up, without as much as an apology to us, heirs and victims of utopia and vampires, time thieves and widow makers, quietly penning verses. Thank you. Any questions or answers? Yes.
The passage you read about the previous century becoming an empty box, it seems to me that that applies every century. And is there something about the Earth going around the sun once a year and us counting 100 of those and that cycle of renewal?
It has to do, I think, with a peculiar human way of remembering history. In the first place, because history is written by the winners, as we know. On the other, it has to do with the unpleasantness of remembering and with the impatience of the young of listening to people who actually lived through certain events. And so we think that by putting these things in books or on CDs or something, that will actually relive somehow the experience, but they become drained of the life that was in them. So the question of memory, is, yeah, it's the memory, but it's like a dried rose between the pages of a book. It's a shape. It's not something living anymore. I mean, this is a peculiarly human thing. Maybe it's part of our evolutionary drive. Maybe it's a very good thing to have I think ADD is evolutionary. So, yes.
So I'm embarrassed to say that although I've heard you for years on NPR, I actually haven't read any of your books, but I'm planning on it.
Well,
so I don't know if you've spoken to this, so forgive me if you have, which is, have you been concerned about the almost disconnect in the connectedness of our culture right now? Like, for example, we have a 9-year-old who's like kind of a throwback to whenever because she's not plugged in. And we find that it's almost like we're chastised because, this is a kid who can entertain herself. Do you see that like Einstein didn't have baby Einstein and Mozart didn't have baby Mozart, and I'm 100% sure Bill Gates didn't have a little leapfrog or something like that. Who's going to invent these things? I mean, have you spoken to any of that?
Well, it is a real good question, and it is one that because we try to create markets all the time and put them where imagination used to roam free. That we're actually putting programming where there used to be freedom to make a story or to imagine a character, and there's a real danger in the fact that we're getting so good at creating very micro markets of ages. We know exactly how 6 and 1/3-year-olds might want to read and put those things out there or might want to see. So you're right that I'm not sure it's, you can, I know there are parents who consciously try to give their children that space, and I think it's wonderful. Certainly mine had it, but, the technology was not quite as intrusive as it is now. So you almost have to, well, one of the things that you could do is, at a certain age, just go to prison. Just commit a crime, because the prison is a wonderful place to be disconnected, unless they actually turn on the TV. And I know they don't let you have a laptop. It's a monastic decision in a way, your parents can make it for you up to a certain age, and then after that, you have to decide whether, you go there or not. On the other hand, if it is inevitable, there is entirely too much synergy, I think. And part of the crisis that we're experiencing now, if we're experiencing a financial crisis, I think, because suddenly everything connected, And these wonderful things that people invented turned out to be bad, you know. I mean, things like, you know, derivatives. Well, the reason why derivatives are a bad thing are not because, I mean, they're ingenious, they're terrific, but there is a fundamental sin in there, which is that it turned a verb into a noun. Because you have the verb to derive is one thing, and the derivative, which is, it's too hasty a noun, you know. So I think whoever did that was brilliant in making up that financial instruments, but it's not a good enough thinker to figure out that language can have consequences like that. Yeah.
So this morning on the radio, you were talking about New Orleans and how it's a smaller city and maybe it isn't so good for the average person, but there are some benefits for artists. And I wonder if you could elaborate a little more.
Well, many young people came to help after Katrina. They came to help rebuild houses, and they came to work on the Musicians' Village, and there are different kinds of non-profits that came, and a lot of them stayed. And one of the things that New Orleans got out of it is that the Contemporary Arts Center started this year something called Prospect One, which eventually is going to become like the Venice Biennale, a two-year event in which artists will take over different houses and environments and parts of the city that were wrecked and make art there. This year they had a map that wasn't too good, but the results are spectacular because the Contemporary Art Center invited some very well-known artists from New York, which pissed off a lot of the locals, and so they immediately created their alternative spaces, so the place suddenly came to life, which was great. So it was like having Sundance, and then the other festival just popped right up instantly. So yeah, it's a good place for art, and it's a good place because we face so many actual big questions about how to remake a city and what kind of architecture to use and what makes a city good when you remake it. That these are fundamental questions that interest artists, and I think a chance for young people to be there on the ground floor is pretty spectacular. So there will be more. Eventually, hopefully, we'll just get rid of all the laws and there will be nothing but artists and criminals. who are symbiotic, actually. Yeah.
If we're now post-human, I was curious about the other end of the arc when we went from pre-human to human. Was that something that happened in the Enlightenment or with the Romans?
Well, there are a number of stages of that, obviously. The minute we crawled out of the wonderful water, it must have felt terrible. It was kind of like being in exile, you know, leaving your country and making it on land. That was pretty bad. Yeah, that was a big one. And then there was a big one when Thoth, the Egyptian god, invented the alphabet. Aristotle already has a wonderful passage where one of the other Egyptian gods is reproaching Thoth for inventing the alphabet. And he says, you've made a terrible invention. He says, because now people will remember nothing of themselves. They will trust their memories to writing. So it was already a known problem. So from there are several ways in which humanity went forth, you know. But some are big, you know, like the leaving the sea and the alphabet. And we're probably on the verge of another one. I may not actually see it, but I think my students will, and it's pretty amazing. I don't nap because I'm from Europe. Europeans can't nap, you know. You're too nervous for that because there are some Cossacks showing up or something. Americans have the freedom of napping, you know. I've noticed that Americans can actually take naps. But, you know, when I sometimes just kind of lie there and then I wake up and I think, whoops, I'm either in the future now or I'm dead, which is about the same thing. But, you know, I feel sometimes that I'm living in the future already, but I don't think it's quite as radical a future as the one that's coming. And, you know, probably by that time it won't make any difference whether I'm alive or dead either, you know. It will make a difference to me because I like food. I don't know, did that answer any question? Yes?
Given your, if there's lack of nobility in humanity, what do you think about the singularity, and if and when machine intelligence gets to a point where they figure out they don't need humans anymore, and how does that relate to post-humanity?
Well, that's a hell of a lot of ideas you just put into that question. The nobility, I don't quite understand, but...
that was something you had said earlier.
Oh, I did? Yes. That was in the noble phase of my speech, I guess. What was the rest of it?
You made a point about humanity not necessarily being noble. There's been a lot of times when it's not great to be human.
Right.
And I'm wondering about looking at the future and the ideas. I think Ray Kurzweil and others talk about the notion of the singularity when machines become, and we work on software that some people say it's going to be too buggy for the singularity for it to ever happen. But if it does, is that a good thing or a bad thing or indifferent?
Well, I think singularity is the key. I mean, that symmetry we know exists everywhere and it's inevitable. Singularity is something else, and I don't know if we mean the same thing by it. I mean, you probably know something, you probably mean something more specific by it, but I know that in, for instance, the stories of the 1001 Nights are 1001 nights because of the numeral 1 is singular, because in many religious cultures, God is singular, is one. And so it's odd numbers are employed by storytellers and by culture to always point to the fact that there is a one, there is a singularity, there is something that doesn't quite, fit. So I'm not, what do you mean by singularity?
The singularity I'm referring to is the idea that eventually machines will become smart enough and they'll self-replicate and they'll figure out they don't need humans anymore. It's kind of from the Terminator movie, I think.
I know.
Is talking about that as a future.
I don't think by that time we'll actually care. I mean, if a symbiosis like that occurs, then the human part of us will think it's terrific, because the machine part will be part of it. It'll be hard to know whose consciousness exactly we're expressing or representing. I mean, I don't think we can do anything about it. I mean, we can a little bit, but it's it's against the tide. I don't. I'm already 60% electronic. It's probably my iPhone dictates my consciousness. Oh, whoops. I forgot who I was talking to. Well, these matters were great matters for speculation, and I know that the science fiction writers have been doing it for quite some time, and I'm sure that they're right, both the dystopic and the utopic ones. I work on some other level, which is that I don't really speculate about what's going to happen as much as try to investigate what's still useful in from the 20th century to keep us sane. Yes.
You mentioned earlier that ADD is evolutionary, and I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that and talk about what the role of attention is as you see it now and how that's evolving, or lack of attention.
Well, my students seem to be doing a whole lot of stuff at the same time. They text, they talk to each other, they have fantasies, sexual probably mostly. And they sort of listen to me, so they are already doing 4 or 5 things at the same time, so they're too impatient to actually focus. Attention is a discipline, and it's one that should be taught in schools and at the very beginning, how to focus and how to breathe. I mean, it's a form of all the spiritual practices teach the practice of attention, or the practice of breathing, and it's important to be able to, because we can't really not be an ADD world because of all that we know. It's important to be able to practice meditations in an emergency, which is the title of a wonderful title of a book of poetry by Frank O'Hara, great American poet, which is itself the result of an attention, of a typo. because I've always loved the title Meditations in an Emergency, and then one day I was in a little factory of some kind, and I saw a first aid cabinet, and it said Medications in an Emergency, and I suddenly got it. I said, well, Frank saw that, and he saw the typo. I mean, he just got it. One thing that our machines do a little too quickly is to correct our mistakes. And I believe, and the Dadaists believed in mistakes and typos and mishearing and misunderstanding. All those, they call the pretty misses of discovery. So there is something in learning attention, and more we'll have to teach it as a discipline rather than, think that we may have time for it, because we don't. So, for instance, I teach sweat management in New Orleans in July. Both beginner and advanced. Yes.
Thank you for making your book available on Kindle. What do you think is the future of ebooks versus hard copy books?
Well, Kindle has a big problem. In the homepage of the corpse.org, the journal I edit, a student of mine actually wrote a very good critique of Kindle too. And one of his main charges was that it looks too much like any text on the computer, that they don't use the book type. And that's a real one. And I think that's really about my only complaint. I love reading on the iPhone, and I have Kindle for iPhone, and actually it works fine, but it is a lovely object, if they could fix this type problem, which is obviously not really a big problem. So. Clearly the book has had its run. After Gutenberg invented movable type, the book had a 500-year run, and it's over. I mean, it will be a nice collectible object, but it's done. And I'm not so sorry to see it go. I wrote all my books are here, so. Yeah, pretty much collectible things. Yes?
I'm curious about your use of the term imagination workers in your poem. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, you're the second person who picked up on that. Well, imagination workers exactly in the sense that it is meant. Because we artists are workers, and we work, our imagination is our field, and that is where we work, and it is filled of endeavor like any other, one that's probably more ambitious in its range, but it has a great, its specialty is the unknown. I know it comes from the word imago, which means image, or to see an image, but I think that's probably a dated root, because it's a lot more than image that's at stake. Yes?
Because I'm still a little jet lagged, I'm kind of not sure if you were being literal or facetious with your comment about the 500-year run of the books instead, but to me, the danger of having too much information available, but only, essentially 1 or 20 lines at a time, is it really mitigates the ability to have serendipitous learning. And, like, for example, if you're standing in a library and you're picking a book up off the shelf and you let your eye meander to the other side, you might see something you never would have seen.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I don't know why you people haven't developed virtual reality yet, so you could be in a library.
There's just so many lost opportunities of whether or not you don't use a paper dictionary anymore. You just type in one word and you don't allow yourself to meander.
It's true. It's absolutely true. And I think the solution to this is clothing. Just design clothes that actually are books. And so you can have your library walking all over the place, and you can find one that you want to read. So that way you can combine eHarmony and the library.
Picking up on a Dada theme here,
Yes.
do you advocate that we introduce entropy and randomness into software that today we tightly control and make do exact things?
Definitely.
Instead of underlining only the misspelled words, should we underline several of them?
Well, I don't think you should underline the misspelled words. I turn off spell check as soon as, but I think that, yeah, there should be an element of chance and randomness.
Should we suggest inappropriate words?
Yes. Yes, just like your mind does, I mean, people who don't have Tourette syndrome, do it internally. Yeah, the programming is entirely to program, is to strikes, and of course that this will, I'm sure that some of you are working on things that don't, you have no idea how they will turn out. Yes.
You spoke earlier about symmetry. And were you meaning to imply that the universe is supporting symmetry versus, say, entropy?
Well, all I know is that the first time I took acid, I saw it all. It was, it was impossible to escape the symmetries. And the second time I took acid, it came from Czechoslovakia. It was Czech acid. And I saw that the universe was composed of little sickles and hammers. These were the founding blocks of the universe.
This is your own psychology.
There was a little psychology involved, right? But actually, maybe not, because the Czechs were competing with the CIA in making psychotropic substances, and it was one of the Cold War projects. So it's entirely possible that they somehow introduced the image, and it wasn't entirely me. I'm not sure.
Well, you spoke about Dada and psychology briefly on today's radio program. How does that play with symmetry and entropy? And what you're just describing, for instance. Dada is play.
It is play.
Dada is finding entropic forces.
It is play.
Against symmetry, against the forces of order?
Pretty much. Pretty much. I don't think that the Dada play or being against the forces of order has caused any of the disasters of the 20th century or the coming ones. It's the other way around. Things that are too well thought out and too well defined are where the disasters lie. Psychology, well, the surrealists had an interesting relationship to Freud's work, to dreams, and they thought there was a way to resolve the apparent contradictions between society and psyche. One of the best books ever written, classic really on the subject, is Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's Anti-Oedipus, Capitalism and Schizophrenia. And it is a terrific sort of attempt to put together a good economic analysis with psychology, and it is a very poetic book, and in some ways parts of it are completely dense and impenetrable, probably to the authors themselves if they're still alive. But I'm not sure that can be quite resolved, I mean, of course, we're trying for better living through chemistry, so we'll see. Yes.
I'm curious about this huge building I've heard of, the Palace of the People. Have you ever seen
In
it?
Bucharest, Romania? Yeah, I saw it. It was pretty big. They didn't know what to do with it. Ceausescu had it built and then bankrupted the country building it, and it wasn't finished in 1989 when he was killed. But they don't know. Now Parliament meets in part of it, but they tried to give it to the UN, and the UN wouldn't have it. They tried to make it a children's place, but the first children they brought in there started crying because the rooms are too big. So, I don't know. It's pretty monstrous. Yeah.
I haven't really studied Dadaism at all, but it seems to me that the word itself has sort of a percussive you know, nature to it. And it was interesting this morning to hear your poetry put to music. And I was wondering if you'd had that done before, and how were you satisfied with the results of that project, and would you do it in the future?
Well, I like this, what we did here. I've worked with some artists, with this guy, Mike Gendro in California, who invents instruments, and he's created various kinds of things that are sort of Dadaist in nature. But then we don't work at the same time. I mean, he does his stuff, and then I do mine. So. All right, well, thank you very much. I'll sign books for you.